You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's Editor-in-Chief, Giles Parkinson, and leading energy analyst, David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Janus Electric, enabling freight operators in Australia and overseas to electrify heavy haulage. Energy Insiders is also brought to you by Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Renew Economy and founder and editor of its sister site, Driven. And joining me, as usual, at this time with a smile on his face for some reason, is David Leach, ITK Principal. David, I'm just going to presume you're well, or at least you're cheerful.
I am cheerful, Giles, possibly a little more cheerful in a couple of soccer teams and less cheerful in others, but we won't talk about that. What we would like to talk about is our special guest this week. I have to say one of my favourite guests because of her knowledge and willingness to get at what the gist of a question. And so it's great to have this interview this week, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. Well, with Nicola Falcon, who's the head of system design at the Australian Energy Market Operator, and who's been heading up the team that's designed the integrated system plan, or the latest version of that, first produced in 2018. Now we're on the 5th version, I think. So we caught up with Nicola. Now, I do apologise. We had a few issues. David was out in the country, so Nicola couldn't hear his questions, so I had to relay them, even though our recording device actually heard them eventually. But I think we've had to edit out David's voice, unfortunately. But we are sharing your questions, David. But anyway, let's have a listen to our interview with Nicola Falcon from AEMO. Nicola Falcon from the Australian Energy Market Operator. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
Look, congratulations on another wonderful body of work in the integrated system plan, which you're probably sick of talking about right now, but we do appreciate you coming onto the podcast. Look,
Thank you.
there's probably just a few high-level things. I mean, it's been sort of, people have sort of been going through the entrails of this thing for the last couple of weeks, but I just wanted to pick up on some of the higher-level issues. And I guess the first one is, what has changed over the last, say, 6 months since you did the draft? What's changed over the last 2 years? And then I'd actually like to come, what's actually changed since you first did the report 8 years ago?
Ooh.
And I guess one of the overriding themes is that AEMO is consistent in saying that the transition to renewables and storage remains the most effective and the cheapest option to replace Australia's ageing coal fleet. But there's been a few variables and moving things within that general assumption, hasn't there?
Yeah, well, the market's certainly not slowing down. Consumers are certainly not stopping investing in their own energy resources. And as we know, we've got to continue to try and plan, I won't say maintain the plane while it's flying, but it does feel a little bit like that. This plan, that is a 2-year plan, needs to stay relevant, even though everything around it is changing so quickly. What's changed since the draft? Well, the draft goes out intentionally for consultation, and we had some really rich feedback from our stakeholders that we wanted to make sure we could capture in the final.
Is that rich in the nice way, or the?
No, absolutely rich. No, I'm genuinely saying it as rich feedback because, this sort of plan needs diversity of perspectives to be really robust, and so we really appreciate all of the feedback that we do get from stakeholders, and it's been in large very constructive. So we've made a number of changes between the draft and final to reflect that feedback. And at the same time, as I was opening, that the investors are continuing to invest, and we've had this huge amount of grid-scale batteries in particular becoming sort of anticipated and committed, which in our words is really just saying they're pretty certain that they're now going to become connected over time. And so we want to make sure that we capture all of that in the modelling. The other thing that's been happening is the cheaper home battery subsidy has driven a lot of investment for mums and dads and households. There's been about 420,000 batteries installed since July 2025. So, all of that changes the dynamics. We wanted to make sure we incorporated all of that in the plan. But despite all of those changes, and some of them are quite significant, you're right that the consistency in the messaging at the high level continues to be that, when we are seeing coal plants aging and retiring, the cheapest way to replace that generation is with renewable generation connected by a distribution and transmission network, uh, firmed by storage and backed by gas. And that's been a really consistent message for a number of years.
AEMO'S long said and made very clear that the biggest risk, I guess, in the operations of the grid right now, I mean, there's obviously sort of various weather events and there can be outages and what have you, and extreme weather events. But it said that one of its biggest fears is sort of unexpected outages, particularly from aging coal plants and other aging plants. So really, is there any other option than to actually sort of make this transition and make it as fast as you can, because or as fast as the country can, because there is some contention out there that, well, we should just if we can't build any new wind and solar, then we should just keep the coal plants open.
Yeah, keeping the coal plants open is just not going to be a feasible option long term. I mean, the average age of the fleet is around 40 years at the moment. We're seeing that coal plants are typically starting to fall over any time from 40 years upwards. I think the average age of the coal that's retired to date is about 44 years. So whether or not it's replaced with renewable generation or something else, those units are not going to be there for us to rely on in the future. And we're going to need to be able to find new investment in generation and storage to be able to replace those coal plants as they retire. And we're also forecasting that demand is going to be doubling from where we are today. So we need to not only find generation and storage that's going to be able to support a reliable and secure power system once those coal plants age, but we also need to find new generation to be able to meet that rising demand.
Yeah, and we'll get to demand later, because I think David's got a few questions on that. But I've got a couple more just on these changes. Now, you mentioned even just from the last draft, there's been the home battery scheme and the impact of that. I think the number's actually now 450,000, according to the federal minister. Grid scale battery storage has soared. And if you look back to 2018, when the first ISP was released, I mean, that is quite stands out as the biggest difference. Then I think, and I doff my hat to Rob Grant here, who pointed this out on LinkedIn. Then I think sort of battery storage was considered a variable rather than sort of a central assumption. And consumer energy resources have kind of come from nowhere. We had rooftop solar in those days, but now we've got not so much orchestrated, but some more sort of dispatchable, if you like, or we've got more battery capacity in consumer energy resources, and we've got EVs coming away. Are those the two big changes from the first draft to this draft? And can we expect even a bigger increase in technology change over the coming years?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. I mean, there's been a number of other subtle changes, in the scope of the ISP has changed since that 2018 as well, partly to reflect the fact that there is a bigger role now for consumer energy resources, and we've started to now look at what might be needed even in the distribution network to really be able to unlock the capacity that is being built in mums and dads' homes. But the other one in this 2026 ISP is a greater perspectives on the interactions between the electricity and the gas networks, because we're continuing to see that gas is going to play a really critical role in the future as well. So there's been a bit of an evolution in terms of the technology changes, but also the role that those technologies might play.
The ISP is based around sort of government policy, in particular sort of federal government policy. You had to make some adjustments with Queensland. It's designed around what we need to do to meet the target of, say, 82% by 2030. Does AEMO actually believe that that target can or will be reached? I noticed in the latest ISP you have published what you describe as a constrained scenario, which I guess reflects some of the realities of what's happening in the market out there. Hard to get sort of, supply parts and sort of logistics and planning issues and investment holdups. What do you think we're going to get? Can AEMO say, where do we think we're going to get to? I think the constrained scenario had the target actually at around, or the share of renewables actually in the mid-70s, I think it is.
Yeah, I think it was about 75% that we had
Yes.
the target on 2030. And we did get to the 82%, but it was just a bit later. Look, the thing that we really want to make sure is that the ISP is robust to changes. We started this discussion by sort of talking about everything that's been changing around us. But decisions need to be made now, particularly decisions on investment. And the reason that we included the constrained delivery scenarios, we wanted to make sure that any investments, particularly in the transmission that has a sort of unique role within the ISP, it has this actionability sort of status. We wanted to make sure that the investments in that transmission were robust to the pace of the transition. And there has been a lot of commentary around how tough it is to get some of these developments over the line. We wanted to explore whether that was going to change some of those transmission investments or not. And the overarching insight that we got from that constrained delivery is that even if generation and storage was developed at a slower pace than what we had projected in what we call our optimal development path, the transmission that is in that path, the transmission that is needed to be able to connect the renewable generation and share resources across the NEM remains incredibly valuable, and in fact more valuable. And what it does is it actually helps to keep the costs down as low as possible for consumers, and also de-risks in that situation that coal may not be able to operate in the system as long as we're currently forecasting.
Just, I guess, the speed and the scale of the rollout of data centers. I mean, how many gigawatts are you actually expecting, say, in the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years?
That's the million-dollar question, really, isn't it? Just how quickly these data centers are going to develop, how quickly the load will ramp up, and whereabouts those data centers are going to invest is really, really critical for the system and planning, and something that is very uncertain. We've got roughly about 2% of demand being met by data centers at the moment, and we're forecasting that that's going to increase by the time we get to 2050 to about 10% of underlying demand. And there's a bit of a ramp up across the period from there. I haven't got the exact numbers in front of me, but the point is really that it's so uncertain at the moment that the best we can do is to model a number of different scenarios. We can start with quite a range of what it might look like in the future and make sure that we've got a plan for however that might evolve. Just to give you a bit more perspective about why it is so uncertain, we are tracking the data center interest very closely, and it informs our demand forecasts. Probably about 50% of the projects that we were tracking last year are no longer progressing, and another 50% have come in instead. So there's a lot of I guess we call bragawatts out at the moment. It's very, very difficult to pin it, but there's no question that there is strong interest and there will be increases in demand from data centers.
I think Daniel Westerman gave a speech a couple of weeks ago talking about it's a sort of a steady, it's just a steady demand profile, but there's also these sort of these weird events that can happen when the data centers seek to protect themselves and they just suddenly switch off. How much does that concern you?
Look, that certainly wouldn't be desirable if we had gigawatts of load suddenly switching off to protect themselves. And we've been progressing some what we call access standards with the AEMC to ensure that expectations are set early for data centers to make sure that that doesn't happen. That would be a very problematic situation for us to be able to deal with on the power system. And what we've found is that, providing the information and the certainty for the developers early helps them to make sure that they design their data centers so that they can ride through these sorts of disturbances on the grid.
We hear that sort of some of these data centers, because they demand so much sort of uptime reliability, 99.999 or whatever it is, and they kind of surround themselves with diesel gen sets to sort of guarantee their own supply. Might that actually be a resource that you can actually tap into to sort of give further reliability to the grid? I mean, is that something that you've even thinking about?
Oh, look, there's a lot of opportunities with data centers. Not all of them need that sort of reliability, 99%. There's a lot that can do through AI training and that sort of thing. They don't necessarily need to have that data latency. So what we're starting to see is there's sort of two classes of data centers being developed. Some will have more demand flexibility, and that's really exciting in terms of what they could do to help support the grid as well as support their own business model. There's a lot of work being done looking at whether there is potential to provide incentives for them to offer in some demand flexibility, or as you say, switch to using their own generation or battery storage at times when it would be more convenient for them to source their own supply and make sure that we can keep the grid stable. So that there are lots of options there. The other thing that they do help with is the minimum demand on the system. So we've been in the last few years looking at declining minimum demands, which minimises or reduces the number of operational levers we have to manage the grid when a majority of that daytime demand is being met by rooftop PV. If we've got the data centre load in there, then that changes the picture quite a bit and gives us a bit more of a chance to keep enough system strength in the system, which is good.
You talk about the flexibility in the demand center, in a data center. Is that a certain type of data center, or is that just like a mindset of the way the operators want to actually manage that data center?
No, certain data centres will have more scope for flexibility than others, but at the moment there are some rule changes being looked at to sort of think about whether that's a voluntary market type mechanism, whether it's mandated. Some countries sort of mandate a demand flexibility or a peak demand management approach. There's a few different options that are on the table being looked at.
David's question is about offshore wind, and if it weren't to go ahead, and Victoria's got a 9 gigawatt mandate, which you've dialed into your optimal development path, what happens then to the scenarios, and does that potentially mean an upgrade of the capacity of the VNI West or other transmission lines?
Yeah, with the integrated system plan, we're required to consider all policies. So we haven't done a run that looks at what would happen without the Victorian offshore wind. The closest we got was the constrained delivery sensitivity, which had offshore wind delayed 3 years, so that the entire trajectory was sort of delayed 3 years. And that does require some more onshore development. Obviously, the coal plants are still retiring, and we need to find other ways to replace that generation if the offshore wind's not there. But as I said, we haven't done a system plan without offshore wind in the mix.
What impact is there on the sort of the carbon cost estimate if Queensland goes through with its current plan, which is to keep its coal-fired power stations open for as long as they can manage it?
Oh, we haven't done any sort of assessment on carbon costs of various government policies. What we can say is that we have incorporated the Queensland government's intent to keep the coal plant in Queensland open longer and to maintain them. We do find, therefore, that Queensland coal is in the system longer than the others, and what we find then is that we get more renewable generation being used to help counterbalance any emissions coming out of the coal plant to ensure that we keep within the emission targets that we had put into the model. So we don't look at the carbon cost per se, but we certainly do incorporate the intent of those policies.
I mean, you mentioned data centers as a major source of demand, but the ISP actually talks about a bigger source of demand, or demand coming from electric vehicles, and the number of electric vehicles that could be on the roads in Australia in, say, 5, 10, 15 years, but also the potential for them for bidirectional charging. Can you tell us a bit more about what you're thinking there?
Yes, electrification is a significant factor in the increase or the doubling of demand that I mentioned at the beginning. And we're already starting to see quite a surge in the investment in electric vehicles in these last few months as fuel prices have sort of tipped the economics and the benefit for consumers a little bit more. So we do see that trend will continue and expect that electrification is going to be a significant source of demand that we're going to need to supply. What we've got with, at the moment, there's something called vehicle to grid that is in really still infancy in Australia, and it's being trialled at the moment. But one of the sensitivities that we did in the ISP was to look at what would happen if there was this concept of vehicle to grid, which really allows for not just one way consumption of power from an electric vehicle, but you could imagine coming home and plugging in and then almost acting as if it's a large battery for your own home, or even directly into the grid. So you've got your two-way flow of power from your car as well as into your car. What we're done is a bit of a sensitivity to say, well, how much would that actually benefit the system if we could tap into and harness some of that storage from the electric vehicle when it's not being needed for its obvious primary use. And we've also looked at, similarly, what would happen if there was more coordination of rooftop PV and home batteries that could benefit to the grid as well as to the consumers. And we estimated that there would be a cost saving of about $5 billion if we could tap into and harness some of that resource at times to serve both the consumers and the power system at the same time. So there's a real potential there to provide more demand flexibility, but it's in its infancy when it comes to electric vehicles.
And where does that cost saving come from? Is that sort of less generation and utility scale storage needed, or is that fewer transmission lines?
Most of the analysis that we did was showing it's less large scale storage that's needed. So you reduce the amount of capital costs on the grid because you're actually harnessing some of that capacity in a similar form at a smaller scale. But there will be reductions in network costs as well, and it's just probably more so at the distribution network, but we haven't done full detail modelling on the network cost savings. So most of that $5 billion is just on the savings in batteries.
What about we've seen you going back to some of the household batteries again. AEMO'S sort of commented about the impact that is already visibly happening, particularly in sort of various demand peaks that we've seen, particularly over summer. Some of the record high demands and prices have not been as high as they might otherwise have been because people have been lots of people got batteries, and that sort of flattened the prices. And the ISP, I think, talks about sort of two scenarios about it talks about this, whether household batteries need or should be orchestrated, and the passive role of household batteries. And I think there was some surprise about the benefits and the impact of passive batteries, but there still is some desire, I think, by AEMO to have as many of them orchestrated as possible.
It's consumer choice. And so what we're really wanting to do is make sure that we can integrate those resources into the grid if that is what consumers would like to do. It's certainly not mandated, but we do demonstrate that if designed appropriately so that there is incentives and motivations for those consumers, then it can be more equitably shared, and that access to that solar can, particularly at times when the consumer that is invested in that resource doesn't have a need for it. If we can access that and be able to better support the power system, then there is benefit for everybody. So we're looking more, we're not pushing it, it's definitely consumer choice, but we're looking at how that coordination could better harness the resources that are available and help keep costs down for consumers. The interesting one you mentioned about even if they weren't coordinated, we are still seeing the impact in moderation of peak prices. And just to sort of give it in perspective, we put out a quarterly energy dynamics report in March and demonstrated in that households that have the solar and battery systems actually are reducing average evening peak grid demand by about 1 kilowatt per household compared with solar-only households. And so that's even without the coordination. We're seeing that more and more households that have the batteries invested are bringing off that sort of peak demand and helping keep prices lower than otherwise.
So do some quick maths then. If we've got 2 million households with home batteries by, say, 2030 or soon afterwards, that's 2 gigawatts of reduced demand in the evening peak. That's significant.
Correct.
Absolutely. Visibility. With the growth of consumer energy resources, the growth of the rooftop solar systems, which are still banging along at a crazy rate, not that's a bad thing, but it's more than people forecast a while ago. Home batteries, electric vehicles. If they're not orchestrated, can you still see it all? Because if you've got half the grid operating behind the meter, literally, and you can't see it, is that a problem?
Operational visibility is absolutely something that we are working through as part of the National Consumer Energy Resources Roadmap. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to, I can imagine listeners imagining that it's like Big Brother and we need to see what every individual household's doing. But in aggregate, when it interacts with the transmission system, we need to at least be able to have some predictability about how it will interact. Otherwise, we're going to start seeing, significant swings in the demand or the supply that we haven't been able to predict, and therefore it's very hard for us to adapt to that from the grid scale. So definitely something that we want to get on top of and make sure that can be managed in a coordinated way.
Right. Can you get that visibility without orchestration? Is there other ways? Directly from the networks?
Um, It doesn't have to be necessary through orchestration. There are other ways that you can infer things and do analysis, and we're working very closely with the distribution networks as well to see what information they can provide sort of at the interface between their network and ours.
I think the last time I talked to you, and one of the key things of getting to, say, a share of 82% renewables by 2030, or even if we get there by 2031 or 32 or 33, or whenever it is the ability to run the grid at 100% renewables at times. Now, that means either having something in the background to do system strength. There's a lot of orders for a lot of synchronous condensers, but I think the ISP actually mentions that there's an issue there of actually getting hold of enough in time. I think the last time we talked to you, I think AEMO talked about its sort of engineering roadmap, talked of this need to have a trial with a mini grid somewhere on the main network to see if battery inverters, grid-forming battery inverters, could actually do that job. Is there any sort of progress in that particular plan?
Yeah, we've been working very hard on that and a number of other trials, actually. There's a couple of good prospects there. We're still working through the trial design because there's a few risks that need to be managed and as we test those things. But really, really encouraging to see some of the options that we're pursuing. And the other thing that we are doing is starting to have more conversations with protection engineers to make sure that when we talk about protection quality fault current, we're all sort of talking about the same thing. We understand what that means. There's a bit of translation that needs to go on sometimes. Not all engineers, are the same, and the protection engineers are really working hard to try and help us understand exactly what's needed to keep their assets protected.
It's really interesting, actually, just the sort of different views in engineers. I mean, does it come down to the age of those engineers? Does it come down to what industries they've come out of, or what sort of technologies they've come out from? I mean, it's fascinating to think that there is this sort of such diversity of opinion about how you actually solve these issues.
No, I don't think so. I think it's just the fact that they probably, they're the experts in their assets and the protection systems. They understand what's needed there, but it's about making sure that can be conveyed as appropriately as possible. Just like any other sort of discipline, you've got to make sure we find that when we talk to, IT at times, you've got to make sure you've got the right translation to understand and align their expertise with ours and get them mixed match. So no, I don't think there's any particular pattern out there. We just got to make sure that we're aware from the system what's needed and the protection engineers are aware of what's needed on their assets as well.
Just with the change in technologies and the progress in technologies and the fact that sort of 8 years ago it was difficult to predict where we would be now with battery storage and consumer energy resources and things like that, might there be some sort of technology change? I guess, look, this is sort of looking in the seaweeds a bit, but might there be just some sort of rapid technology change where we get to the point where you look at the ISP and go, okay, maybe we need to start over?
Look, there certainly could be, and I've probably got the view that if that does occur, and it means that this new technology is better than what we are working with at the moment, that's got to be a good thing. So I'm certainly not seeing that as a negative. I reflect back to, I've been doing this for a while now, and I think back to the times when we were all assuming geothermal was going to come in and save the day and give us this baseload renewable generation, and learnt very quickly that planning to include technologies that haven't actually reached commercial viability yet is probably not the smartest move. Better to work with what you've got at the moment, and if there's a breakthrough and a new technology comes in that means that we can deliver this better, faster, cheaper, that's fantastic.
I've still got some shares in Petrotherm, actually, if you'd like a couple of on the cheap. But anyway, Nicola, so what's the major, what's the next big thing on AEMO'S plan at the moment? Is it sort of an update of the engineering roadmap? I guess you're probably going to start, you just finished one ISP, you're probably going to start preparing for the next one now, but what's next on the list of things to do?
Yeah, we're sort of having a bit of an in-house joke at the moment that the ISP is a little bit like painting the Sydney Harbour Bridge. As soon as you get to the end, you started the new one, and we are starting the new one, starting to think about our scenarios and inputs and assumptions, because by the end of this year, we publish the draft inputs, assumptions and scenarios that get used for the 2028 ISP. But you're right, we've got a few other publications. It's more than just the integrated system plan. Our transition plan for system security will be coming out towards the end of the year. So there's a lot of work we're doing on that. We've got the electricity statement of opportunity coming out in August that sort of looks at how we're tracking and make sure that we've got the right investment coming in. So a number of things immediately to do. And then we're also continuing to connect the projects that come through. So we're soon to actually just as a teaser for next week, we'll be putting out our connection scorecard that shows the volume of connections that have come into the grid in the last year, and it's pretty staggering. So look out for that. It's exciting stuff.
So things are accelerating then. Just back onto that transition plan to 100% renewables then, and I sort of asked you before about this mini-grid trial, and maybe I'm sort of over gaming it and how essential that is. But I mean, is that something that's likely to be done this year, or is that sort of slipped in terms of timelines and things?
Look, it hasn't been slipped. It's urgent for us because we see it as if it can be proven that these batteries that are grid forming and there's a lot of them coming to the system. If it can be proven that they can support protection quality fault current, then that's a really big game changer, which will help ensure that this transition also is done as efficiently as possible. So it's urgent for us. We're continuing to put our foot on the pedal on it. It's going to take some time, so we won't have the answers at the end of this year, but we're going to keep on providing information. We hope to be able to publish information as we learn about it over the
Okay.
period.
Still looking for a town or an industry or something like that who's going to be a guinea pig on that one?
Yeah, and you're talking about protecting assets, so you've got to also think about what the implications would be if the trial doesn't work.
Fair enough. Nicola Falcon, look, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for sort of being a good sport as we sort of struggle through a few technical issues. Yes, fortunately, we're not running the grid here, but you are having greater success than us at the moment. So thank you very much for joining the Energy Insiders podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
And that was Nicola Falcon from AEMO with me and David's questions. We'll be back with the news of the week after this break. You are listening to the Energy Insiders podcast with Giles Parkinson and David Leach. Actually here this time because I can hear him, and I'm sure the recording device can hear him. A bit frustrating for you, David, but look, as you said at the start of the podcast, some very frank and open responses from Nicola. And look, there's a lot of contention about AEMO, about the ISP and what it's designed to do, and the fact that it has to change so quickly. But I think that's just sort of part of the technology change. So.
Well, I think there are a few things for people who want to talk about the ISP need to understand if they want to do it properly. That is, what its actual design goals are, the constraints that it's subject to, which are effectively government policy, and it's the result of a modelling process. I mean, all that said, it remains the single best plan and resource that we have by some considerable distance for how to design out the system, despite the changes in policy that come along that result in some technologies being included in some years and not in other years.
Yeah, one of the ironies of it is that actually the first two or even the first three ISPs were actually produced under the coalition government, and it kind of came up with this was the most likely scenario as being 80% share of renewables despite them, and then kind of Labor sort of adopted that as their policy, and then the AEMO had to sort of go back and say, okay, well, that's now the benchmark. So it's quite an interesting way that's come about.
It's a target, not a policy, I have to say, the Labor thing. And I think this is very important because if it was a policy, we'd probably see a lot more happening than we actually are happening. Now, there's a couple of things related to the ISP that we need to discuss. And because I have been so bound up in looking at data centres from a number of different points of view, you're going to have to do most of the heavy lifting here, Giles. So I think we had on the first instance the Gen cost numbers released for this year, What did they say that we didn't already know?
Well, not much that we didn't already know, but there is confirmation out there that battery costs continue to fall in double-digit figures, which I think we kind of know. And I guess it's probably a little bit retrospective. There's probably a question now about whether they are continuing to fall at this present moment, and I'd suggest that they're probably stabilised a bit. It did suggest that solar prices have probably stabilised and even risen a little bit. But the good news is that wind prices appear to have stabilised and not continuing to rise.
I don't know how they'd work that out because we don't get any new bloody wind projects, but we'll come back to that.
Well, that's true. And the price of everything else has gone up simply because try finding a gas turbine, try finding someone who wants to build nuclear or coal, or even someone who wants to build, find some syncons. And just on that point, and we talked about this with Nicola Falcon, the sort of the use of syncons or grid-forming inverters for system strength in a high renewable grid. And it was interesting to see that Transgrid has actually sort of put his hand up and said, well, syncons are now really expensive. We can't actually get enough, and we're going to dial down the number of big spinning machines we're going to put there and get more battery storage. So I thought that was quite interesting and probably a good thing.
It is interesting, Giles, and it only confirms, that what everyone that we have talked to says mostly that essentially there's no real reason why batteries and inverters can't do the same job as syncons for all intents and purposes. But today, I think we're going to see more of that. I think that's been blindingly obvious to you and I for years and years. So one of the irritating things, it's like electric cars. You see all the sales in June that you expected to see in March, and that's the trouble, the leads and the lags in the system. And what we know is going to happen, or anyone who studies it really closely, and when it actually happens can be two apparently unrelated things. But let's move on from that, because the other thing related to the ISP has been the absolute fact that the CIS hasn't produced any stuff coming out of the ground to any great intents and purposes. And the New South Wales government, which is gnawing its fingernails off and really needs some new generation, has therefore, I think, moved into with the renewed LTESA program, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting what's emerged from that. So I think people were trying to sort of bidding into the LTESAs and to the CIS's contracts at the lowest possible price, and they're being selected accordingly. Now they kind of realise that maybe that doesn't work best of all, and we're now going to get the most valuable price and the ones which are most likely to get built. Now, who'd have thought? Who would have thought?
Who would have thought that value is more important than cost? Gee whiz, honestly. They're really great people running this, aren't they?
So the message has come out really strongly, and there was a briefing, actually a few weeks ago now, and it came from the people at ASL and just really making it clear, look, that we want to get things built. That's where the value is going to be. So bid whatever you need to get things built. And I think there was basically a recognition that PPAs do not exist out there because the big utilities haven't signed any. Maybe sometime the data center will, but we don't know whether that's going to happen anytime soon. And there's not many other big companies apart from the likes of Rio and Fortescue who are building their own out there. So it's basically tell us what you need to get your finance and get construction, and then you can kind of figure out the fine details later. Get it built. So what we'll probably see is a lot of the New South Wales contract winners that bid into the CIS and haven't been able to get over the line, and they're going to rebid back into the New South Wales one, probably get a better deal, and then go forward. What we don't know is to what extent the Commonwealth will adopt the same policy for their current CIS tenders, but one would imagine that given the fact that nothing much is getting built, particularly on the wind side, that will. But that's been made less explicit.
Yes. So my overarching comment would be that it would still be that we could have a more total policy suite, if I can put it that way, that incorporated decarbonisation at a bigger. I hesitate to use the word bigger scale than what we've achieved so far. So, we've got this totally piecemeal policies like novated leases for electric vehicles, which, by the way, is a policy that favours one particular sector, but everyone, that is employed people. But we kind of go with it because it's actually getting results. Home batteries, that's getting results. So, you stick with those policies, and then you kind of don't worry about the ones that aren't working. But, at the moment, we don't have any good policy for charging. I mean, I don't think myself, that is even for cars, I don't think the car charging outcomes that we're getting are particularly good for future cars. You're still getting like 20 kilowatt stations or whatever built in the country town. I even went to a Tesla station on the weekend at Albury-Wodonga, where Teslas were, which was in on the second story of a building, and the driveway was clogged from beginning to end on a Sunday. You couldn't get into the car park. There were so many Teslas there.
Seriously?
So, chargers are obviously going to fall behind, and now that we've had this surge in sales, and so I just think we need to overbuild chargers, and we need more concrete policy. And then, of course, we need the trucks, whereas I think Dan Bleakley was pointing out in China, even though we've got far more electric cars in China, the actual number of electric trucks, they're using as much electricity as the cars, even though there's far fewer of them because they consume so much more. So, the point is we need an overall plan with a number of elements. And I think as much as we're going to have it in the Prime Minister's Department of Data Centres, if Chris Bowen would really put his fantastic drive and ambition and ability to get things done into a more complete plan, I think it would stand Australia very well in the longer term. Which brings me to data centres. Go on.
No, but before we get to data centres, just on that EV charging, yes. I mean, the national EV charging network has kind of fallen short by quite some number. NRMA, I think, have pretty much stuffed that up for whatever reason. I've been trying to get some more information about which gaps need to be filled and how they will be filled. But it's interesting seeing a report from Transport and Environment, who are a very good European outfit.
Who've been on this podcast, by the way.
That's very true, actually. And they just did a report about the fast charging network in Europe. And they just said in all but one country, and I can't even remember which country failed to do it, but basically 26 of the 27 countries had actually achieved what they set out to do in terms of EV chargers and making sure they stayed ahead of the EV uptake. So it can be done, but as you say, with a policy and a target.
That's right. And, and it has to be forward-looking. It has to look at how the charging speeds that we're going to need in 10 years' time, not the charging speeds that people were talking about a year ago. And, the multi-bays. But look, we've done a couple of podcasts on that, and no doubt we'll do more.
Yes, we'll get back to EV trucks in a minute. But you've got something to say about data centres, and the Prime Minister had something to say, and he basically said they will be built.
I think he was talking a lot about music and film and electricity and water supply. And I want to point out that really the things that matter to data centres are not the things that matter to the people that pay electricity bills. I think there's a lot more to be said. I published a big article about this, and I'm going to publish another article about orbital data centres, which themselves are incredibly interesting. They don't represent buildings in space. They represent satellites with one orbital rack. Yes. And there's a lot to be said about them, but
I presume they don't use so much water.
They don't use much water, and this is kind of the point. And their electricity is free, but that's got nothing to do with anything. The real point about data centres, what they care about, is the chip cost. I've said this several times. For the data centre that Firmus is talking about building in South Australia, and they're talking about 2.7 gigawatts, and they've signed some electricity arrangement for 600 megawatts. Now, that sounds fine, but, to fill that data centre up with chips costs about $30 billion. So do you really think they're going to care about the cost of electricity when they've got to find $30 billion for chips? And when RAM, that's the random access memory, it's not even the graphics processors that are so much the issue, or that they are, but the memory that they use need huge quantities, I use quite carefully, of very, very fast speed memory. That's basically what's pushing. It's getting very, very hard to get. It's getting very hard to. The only reason you've been able to get it for the last year is because all the companies that make memory have been moving away from making memory for phones and things, and converting their spare capacity to making memory for artificial processors, for data centers, for AI, and that is going to. They're going to run out of the ability to do that. So if the demand for data centers continues to expand, in the way that people projected it will, and that might be right or wrong, then there's going to be tremendous pressure on memory and things like that. And so that's what really matters to the data centre people, right? Now, the fact that by building the data centres, they make the electricity price perhaps go up, they couldn't care less. Everyone else cares like crazy about that. And so the Prime Minister is right to be focused on that and to have rules around it. But my only point here is that what investors care about, what the data centre operators and owners care about, is not necessarily what the rest of the community cares about. And making sure that the interests are aligned is something that is entirely suited to policy.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see, one, if they can actually bring those rules in for the data centres and their energy needs, because I think Queensland might be a bit of a stumbling block there, but I'm sure there's a way around that, hopefully.
Excommunicate Queensland, Oh, we can't do that, can we?
Well, that's been talked of in the past, I think. And just ensuring that they are bringing their own, at least their own renewable energy needs, because at the moment they're not. I think they admit to sort of having PPAs with existing wind and solar plants to account for about 70% of their
and Giles, they still want to put. If you look at Macquarie Data Centres Group, not Macquarie Bank, not Macquarie Generation, but if the name's not Smith, it's probably Macquarie in Australia. They want to build they want to build a couple of 100 megawatts data centre at Ryde. Well, that's okay, but it is going to cause issues around transmission and everything like that. And it's not necessarily where you would put it if you wanted to get cheap electricity and minimise your transmission cost. And so I do think the siting of all these data centres, again, if you go to RenewMap, which has started putting the data centre locations out there, you can see how they're all clustered around these individual transmission points in the big cities, and that's using up all that transmission capacity. So we do need them when we think about the consumers to bring their own electricity. I guess my point really, when it boils down to, if they have to pay $120 for wind, that's not even a decimal point on their checks. They can do that.
Absolutely.
And so let's go in that direction. But I'm also conscious of what Nicola Falcon said, that 50% of the data centres that were there a year ago with connection requests have already gone away. And so we need to work out who's serious and who isn't.
Yeah, and AEMO have actually repeated that on several different occasions, saying like people talk about all these gigawatts and gigawatts, but it's they just can't see it. It hasn't come forward. I actually saw this really interesting thing. I can't remember who posted it on LinkedIn. It's from Ireland. Data centres now are accounting for 36% of Ireland's demand load,
which is about the same as South Australia's demand, right? So next to nothing.
Okay, yeah, but it's a distinct grid. I mean, it's got connections to the UK and elsewhere. But yes, well, I still thought it was interesting.
Yeah. It's a distinct grid full of Irish people who use electricity. But my point is, it's not in the global scheme of things. It's it's like anyway.
Well, I think I was just getting excited about the share of data centre demand as opposed to the whole demand of the grid, just as we get excited about the share of renewables in the...
Well, Giles, I do think that there is a good case for building data centres in Australia. I do think that with the USA restricting access to some of the leading-edge models, and China undoubtedly will restrict access to its models somewhat and won't even tell you it's done it. There's a case, every country, it's very clear that international cooperation doesn't seem to be as big as it used to be. And there is a case for Australia to have more of its own capabilities, at least. And we do have plenty of places we could build data centres. We could build wind and solar farms. We could do batteries. We've got more batteries in Australia now at utility scale than England has, I mean, we can do it.
Very good. Final subject, back to electric trucks, David. I just wanted to notice that because we've been focusing a lot on electric trucks and EVs over the last couple of months. We've had Daniel Bleakley from New Energy Transport, as you mentioned. We've had Tim Washington from JetCharge. We've had Anthony Headlam from New Volt, and we've had Ben Hutt from Janus Electrics. So a couple of announcements this week. One, New Energy Transport got their first delivery and their first electric truck, so that's a good start, and they're sort of planning a fast rollout. And I was really interested to see Janus with their sort of diesel to electric conversions getting a huge amount of orders in the US. They've gone from 4 to 87 in California. Now they are helped out there by a generous voucher and support system, but it's pretty interesting that they're doing that, and with sort of freight companies there and the Port of Los Angeles who already have electric trucks and are now doing these conversions.
And Newvolt's working on the Port of Melbourne. That's where their trucks are going to get used. And, when you look at it in this cluster analysis that we used to do, we'd look at Gladstone as an industrial hub and see what you could do there. I think ports generally, tugs and the trucks and the container moving shipments, they're great little electrification hubs that you could spread the trucking system out from. So
absolutely, and on that, there was actually a report from the Port of Fremantle where ARENA has been funding a program over there. They've got, I think, half their trucks now are electric. There's been doing a trial there, and they said it's been fantastic, massive cost savings. They said it was an interesting experience with the drivers. First, very reluctant because they're very attached to their diesel vehicles, but they set them in the electric cab, gave them a ride, and they went, oh, we're happy with this. So it was very interesting to sort of overcoming that reluctance and then just completely embracing the new technology. Quiet, easy, fun.
Well, of course they do. We do it. We know. But two other little things before I think we get to the end of this, as usual, ever-lengthening podcast. One is the approval for the Theodore wind farm up in Queensland, a large wind farm, and of course it's still to get to FID, but it's great to see it's got through the Queensland approval process.
Should get to FID. I think it must be in line for one of the Rio Tinto contracts, but I guess we'll wait and see. But anyway, yes.
And I had to have a Valium when I done that. But anyway, so and the second thing I think was to look at Transgrid and the Dinawan substation upgrade down there in the southwest and getting some money for that and community benefits. And I think, I continue to focus on Southwest Res in New South Wales and associated bits in Victoria. I continue to suggest that if state Victorian and New South Wales governments and the federal government put their heads together, they could somehow find a way, particularly around the VNI and the Western Renewables link, to get a lot more generation done along that corridor, more economically than it could be done just about anywhere else.
Interesting. Just on the southwest, I think Squadron Energy have come up with a new wind and battery project, but at the same time, they've also pulled the plug finally and definitively on the Baroola wind farm up in New England, which ran into some local flak and some issues.
You don't mean Boorlong, do you?
I do mean Boorlong, yes.
It's very nice, very good trout fishing at Boorlong.
Well, there you go, and no turbines to contend with. And I just sort of point out too that there's been some more sort of withdrawals from Queensland government-owned entities, just pulling out of option agreements to buy stakes in wind farms and things like that. So a bit frustrating. And I also just picked up the other day that they've pulled out of investing in the Mount Rawdon pumped hydro project. So just like this sort of complete retreat from renewables and storage continues.
Good luck to them with their gas. I'm sure they'll go really well. It's great. What can I say?
Other than thanking our sponsors, Pylon and Janus Electric, who we've actually been talking about a bit in this podcast. But also thank you to Nicola Falcon for coming on and talking about the ISP and some of the future developments in the grid. Thanks to you, David, for being in such cheerful demand.
I think in regard to the ISP, Giles, I think myself and to AEMO generally, I think all of us who work in the industry should say a big thank you to the data that they make available. It's really pretty much unparalleled as far as I know. It's totally free to access, and it enables the sharing of knowledge and the development of models so that even those of us who disagree with AEMO, which mostly doesn't include me, can find a firm foundation and solid knowledge base for doing that.
Very, very good. Do not forget to check out our other podcasts, the Driven podcast focused on EVs, the Solar Insiders podcast focused on solar, of course, and consumer energy resources, and also the Switched On podcast, which is also focused on electrification and lots of other good things. So they're all good podcasts and fascinating interviews. So now that the World Cup is just about over, you can get back into listening to them. Thank you very much, and we'll be back with another episode of the Energy Inside podcast next week. Bye for now.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Australia's top solar companies trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Janus Electric. By converting existing diesel trucks to electric and supporting them with battery swap infrastructure, Janus is helping freight operators cut emissions, lower fuel and operating costs, and extend the life of their vehicles.